Soul Calibur II finally puts the weapons back in your hands, featuring classic Soul Calibur fighters, new warriors, and over 10 modes of play. And exclusively on the Xbox, Todd McFarlane's Spawn brings the pain. Soul Calibur II, rated T for teen. For the soul that burns, there's no power greater than X.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Player One Start. Did you know that the original Xbox was able to produce almost full HD video? To me, that is crazy that this console was capable of that, being that it came out during a time when most people would have still been gaming on CRT televisions. And most of those CRTs are only capable of producing 480i video. Most people in 2001 may never even have heard of an HD television. But by the end of the decade, as that technology became cheaper for the average consumer, HD televisions would become a centerpiece in most Americans' living rooms. Even about 5 years later, the next generation of systems would all ship with composite AV cables, with only one console at the time, the PlayStation 3, offering an HDMI interface for full HD video. So the fact that a console of the previous generation, the Xbox, could produce a near full HD image definitely has me intrigued. And it makes me wonder, what would early adopters of HD technology be able to play on their TV with the Xbox? But before we dive into the few titles that actually supported native HD output, we should define a few terms and explain a couple of concepts. First, when I refer to composite video, I'm referring to the RCA yellow, white, and red connectors. There is only one connector for video, and that is the yellow connector. The other two are for left and right channel audio. By design, this connector is only capable of handling 480i output. And what that means is that the image coming out of this is only capable of having 640 pixels across by 480 pixels tall. But where does that I come in? Well, the I means interlaced. On a normal NTSC television, an image is displayed at 60 frames per second. What interlace does is allow for sharper video by cutting the frame rate in half and only drawing half of the image and then going back and drawing the other half on the next frame. Zooming in on this example, you can see both frames. This worked out great for American television shows that were shot at about 30 frames per second. But in video games, this would allow more graphical detail to be drawn, as it would only have to create an image for 30 frames a second instead of 60 frames per second. Or using some trickery, they could go 60 frames a second, and as you can see from this screenshot, it can lead to some distorted images. By adding a component cable, you could have separate values for red, green, and blue on the video connector, hence allowing for higher resolutions and richer detail on the screen. The audio cables are the exact same as the original RCA cable that used composite, having red and white for left and right audio. These cables can support much higher resolution than composite cables. The first being 640 by 480p. The P stands for progressive scan, which basically means that every single line of the image is drawn every frame. This allowed incredibly sharp and highly detailed images to be displayed on a compatible display that supported 480p. The next step up is 1280 by 720. This resolution is sometimes simply referred to as HD or 720p. You may notice at this resolution, we have a different aspect ratio, allowing for widescreen images to be displayed, filling up an entire widescreen display. And because the image is in progressive scan, at 60 frames a second, every line of every frame is drawn. When properly utilized by game developers, the extra power that was packed into the Xbox by Microsoft could be used to create sharp, stunning visuals at this resolution at 30 or 60 frames a second. The last resolution we're going to talk about is 1080i. That full resolution is 1920 by 1080. And because it is interlaced, you guessed it, not every line is drawn every frame, leading to a maximum frame rate of 30 frames a second. I have seen it mentioned that the resources it takes to render a frame at 720p is the same that it takes to render a frame at 1080i. But if you do the math, there are actually a few more pixels being rendered each frame with 1080i than there is on 720p. I have seen it frequently cited that 1080i is the maximum resolution you can get out of component cables, so even if the Xbox could do 1080p, I don't think they can get that resolution output through component cables. So hopefully that makes sense as I go through and tell you about some of the games released on the Xbox and the resolutions that they were able to get out of this hardware. When looking at the games, I will first say that there are a lot of titles that support 480p output. However, I will not be including any of those titles in this video because they are not outputting at HD, and we are only interested in HD resolutions in this video. What we will look at are the options that were available to those early adopters of HD prior to 2007. And as you might be able to tell from this Nielsen data chart, less than 10% of US households would have owned an HD TV and been able to fully experience the games you are about to see in glorious HD. And after going through my collection, here are the titles that I have that advertise that they either do 1080i or 720p. This is not all of the games, but I was surprised at how many I already had in my collection, as none of these games really broke the bank to collect. When researching online for a complete list of HD-compatible titles for the original Xbox, I found that only these titles shown on screen support 1080i. And the list gets a little more disappointing when you see the only ones I have in my collection, with one of them being Atari Anthology. This game includes the arcade ports of a lot of Atari's greatest hits from the 1980s. Which, in itself, I would have loved to have had this back in the day, but there's really no reason to play this in 1080i. Most of these games were designed for monitors that would have been CRTs back in the day. Some of them, like Asteroids, would have required a vector monitor, and therefore does not really require 1080i either. But I guess this is one of those crime of opportunities where it doesn't cost them any more processing power to render these in 1080i, so why not offer it? Dragon's Lair 3D is another port of a 1980s arcade game that was very popular back in the day for having good graphics, but in this case, they're not upscaling the video footage from the original game. They took the original game and rendered it using full 3D graphics. I think what made this game a little bit easier to render at 1080i is the fact that it uses cel-shaded graphics, and they don't have to do a lot of texture mapping, or at least high-detailed texture mapping. After the initial tutorial where you get used to the controls, you are actually thrown into the same exact game as the arcade, just rendered in 3D. I still died a couple times before I got past the bridge monster, and most of this game's challenge comes down to those time reflex challenges that also plagued the arcade game. It is interesting to me that they decided to port this in a 3D game, and it looks great in 1080i, but I'm not the biggest fan of reflex challenge games, so I'm not sure I'll come back to this one too often. The next title I have in my collection for 1080i is Enter the Matrix. Besides getting a rush of nostalgia from going back in the early 2000s when the Matrix was plastered over everything, no joke, in 2003 my junior prom was actually stormed out due to tornado alerts, so they actually rescheduled our prom to June, which would have been after the seniors graduated, and they called it Prom Reloaded. And perhaps it's timely that I talk about this title at a time when The Matrix 4 is just being released in theaters. This is another game that looks excellent in 1080i. The game itself, though, is a fairly standard third-person shooter. Of course, it uses bullet time like a lot of other shooters from this time period, but I think those were all inspired from the Matrix movie that came out in 1999. By the time this came out, it was being done to death, so I doubt it made this game stand out when it was released, but I think fans of the Matrix probably wouldn't be disappointed with this game and might want to give it a shot. The rest of the HD games in my collection are all in 720p, and there are a lot more of these titles to choose from than the 1080i selection. Again, I don't own all of these, and I'm not going to go through every single one I have because that'll take forever, but here are a few I decided to showcase. 25 to Life is a third-person shooter video game that allows the player to play as both a cop and a gangster at different times throughout the game in a cops and robbers style. The game's mature themes come up right off the bat, though, as your first mission is a gangster trying to escape a scene by gunning down as many cops as you can. Which, if that sounds fun to you, sorry to tell you, you're going to have a hard time anyway because the controls are a bit confusing, and although the graphics look sharp, everything just looks muddied and run down. At least from this first level, I can tell you I had to turn the brightness on my TV up just so I can see what was going on. So for me, this game is a hard pass. On the flip side of that, though, is Amped 2, and this game looks amazing in 720p. This game looks more like a modern remaster of a classic title than it does the classic title itself. And in terms of gameplay, this is one worth playing, especially if you like games like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. There are a few differences in how you pull off tricks compared to Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, but once you get used to it, the game becomes a lot of fun. This is definitely one of the titles out of this lot that I had trouble putting down once I picked it up. Definitely a nostalgic blast from the past, and I would recommend it to people, especially if you like Tony Hawk, but really if you've never played those type of games, this is a good one to start with. Next is Crash Nitro Kart. This is the sequel to Naughty Dog's Crash Team Racing that premiered on the PlayStation, and as far as Mario Kart clones from this time period goes, this one is probably the most playable, at least in my opinion. Keeping in the tradition of the original game, they do have an adventure mode where you have to race to get trophies, beat a boss, and then keep going, but there's also the classic arcade mode and battle mode that you would expect to find in a Mario Kart style game. I remember critic reviews of this game being very harsh towards this game not really offering more than what Mario Kart or even the original Crash Team Racing did, but I think this was a very competent effort, and as history would show, much better than its sequel. In terms of graphics, this game looks absolutely stunning on the original Xbox, being put out in 720p. But I think that's mostly due to the game's strong art direction and cartoony graphic style. One thing I think holds this game back a little bit is the frame rate. I definitely noticed a choppier frame rate in this game, and for a racing game, I really feel like you need to prioritize frame rate over graphics. I mean, ideally you want both, but if you had to choose between the two, that frame rate needs to be up a little bit higher than this. In the game's defense, though, I didn't really notice a lot of slowdown in any particular part in the game. It was just consistently choppier than I would have liked. Overall, I'd say the game is decent enough for a pickup, especially if you like these kart racers, and even though the remaster of this game includes all of the tracks, it does not include this game's story mode. Alright, now here is the first game that I have that seems to be false advertising. This is Aragon, and for the life of me, I could not get this game to output in 720p, even though the back of the box art says it should support it. I didn't find anything in the options, and the entire time my capture card said it was getting in 480p instead. I also don't see this game listed online as one of the titles that supports it, so I'm just going to chop this up to false advertising and say, sorry, this game does not actually put out in HD. And before you all go rushing to the comments section, I will note I am not basing this on the fact that this is not presented in widescreen. I am basing this on the fact that my capture card said the entire time that it was receiving 640 by 480. I also perused the game manual and the options menu to see if there was something I needed to select to get it to display in 720p, and those searches came up empty. So if you know of a trick that I need to do to get this game to go in HD, let me know. FIFA 07, however, does put out in 720p, and it looks great. And I think that's because, just like with Atari, it doesn't really require a lot of power to render those graphics. I don't think it's that difficult to create a soccer game that looks fantastic, because even in the early days of 3D, I think some of these soccer games with this third-person perspective from high up also can look fantastic on those systems. The Xbox version of this game does have the highest rating, and I bet you if you put this side by side with modern FIFA games, you might be hard-pressed to find a difference, because don't they just repackage these every year and just slap new names on it? So those of you that have followed my channel for a while and have picked up on some of my interests, you may be able to pick up already why I'm a fan of Freedom Fighters. The game is a third-person shooter, but it is set in an alternate history where the Soviet Union has invaded and occupied New York City. And I gotta tell you, I really like the game's premise. I am a huge fan of alternate history. So again, I was immediately sucked into this game. You start out in the role of Christopher Stone, who decides to join the resistance movement to fight back against the invading forces. So, surprise surprise, an EA shooter where it's not just pointless violence. Well, okay, there is some of that, but I guess it depends on how you play the game. I haven't made it all the way through the campaign yet, but it was hard to put down. I was sucked into the story, and I think it does have a good single-player campaign. This game was rated at about an 8 out of 10 around release, and I would say that sits about right with me. The Incredible Hulk Ultimate Destruction is an open-world action-adventure video game developed by Radical Entertainment and published by Vivendi Universal. And going into this, I didn't think that the Hulk would make a very good character to play as in a video game, because if they do it right, he's going to be way too overpowered for everything around him. But this game seems to prove me wrong. They were able to create a game that not only provides challenging, but also engaging gameplay that stays true to the character and doesn't really make you feel like you can just breeze right through the game. Again, I think the visuals in this game look stunning, and I think comic book characters and that cell shading provides an art direction that really just makes this game shine when it's upscaled in the 720p resolution. Playing this game today really makes me wish I would have given it a chance back in the day, as I really would have enjoyed playing this back then, but I also enjoy playing it now, so at least I'm getting to it sometime. Marvel Ultimate Alliance is a game that I had previously played on the PlayStation 3, and I think the most disappointing thing to me about that game on the PlayStation 3 were the graphics. I really felt that I was playing a game that was designed to work on the previous gen console, and they didn't really do that good of a job upscaling it or making the graphics better for the next platform. Because looking at this game on the Xbox and comparing it to my memory of it on the PlayStation 3, I really don't see a difference. This is one of those games that I think is best played with more than one person, because you're always going around in a team of 4 superheroes. And if you're looking for some of the best gameplay you can get from a Marvel game that's pre-Marvel Cinematic Universe, I think you can't go wrong with this title. You know, The Sims is a series that I never really got into back in the day, and that's because I started seeing it as EA's version of a money printing machine. I really like games like SimCity, and this is just not that. In fact, until Animal Crossing, there weren't too many life sim games that I really was a fan of. Going back and playing this on the Xbox in HD really wakes me up to the idea of what made these games so popular back in the day, but I'm not quite sure a console version is what people would have wanted to play. But just to show you what I know, I saw this game got ratings of around 9 out of 10 to 9.4 out of 10, so if you do like life sim games, this is probably the one to play. It just kind of goes beyond me because, again, I'm not really a big fan of this game genre in general. And that leads me to one of my favorite fighting games of this generation, and that is Soul Calibur II. After being introduced to Soul Calibur on the Dreamcast, I was very envious that that game was not going to make it over to the PlayStation 2. And it was a very happy day for me when I found out they were going to abandon the Dreamcast and start making games on all of the other platforms. I can't tell you how many hours back in the day I spent playing this on the PlayStation 2, hooked up to a CRT. And after playing it on the Xbox, I can tell you this game really has not looked better than it does to me right now. The gameplay is smooth, again the art direction is very strong, and the HD just make the visuals look very sharp, all without sacrificing that quick-paced gameplay that you would come to expect from a Soul Calibur game. As this is my first time playing it on the Xbox, I had to of course play the console-exclusive character of Spawn, as I didn't have the opportunity to play him on the PlayStation 2. My initial impression of that character is that he seems a bit overpowered, as I was very easily able to make it through this game on one go. Overall, I would recommend this as a must-have on any console, but the Xbox version is quickly becoming my new favorite. And here we have Sphinx, which is another game that advertises that it can do 720p on its box art, and it is not outputting 720p. My capture card again insists that it is getting 480p, and again after going through the settings I could not find a way to get it to go in full 720p. So another game to look out for as a fake HD. Next, I'm just going to combine all of the Tony Hawk games into one review by saying, if you like Tony Hawk and you've played Tony Hawk, sadly, you're not going to get the best version of Tony Hawk in HD on this system. Out of all the ones that are offered, I think Tony Hawk 4 probably provides me with the closest gaming experience that I'm used to, but I am of the opinion that if Tony Hawk gets off of his board in the game, it's not that good of a game. I know a lot of people out there that like the Tony Hawk Underground series and really feel like that they were evolving the series in a direction it really needed to go to keep it from getting stale, but I'm just not that big of a fan of them. My favorite out of the series is Tony Hawk 2 and Tony Hawk 3. Visually though, the games in 720p do look very good, and the frame rate never really seems to be an issue with the fast-paced gameplay, so again, if you're a fan of these titles, I would say pick them up, but I would recommend 4 over the Tony Hawk Underground series. The last game I'm going to look at is True Crime Streets of LA, which was not a game I purchased back in the day, but I do remember renting it for the PlayStation 2. And I remember enjoying this game very much when I first played it, and all the nostalgia came back to me when I heard the character that is voiced by Christopher Walken. This game is an open-world action-adventure game that plays kind of like Grand Theft Auto, but from a cop's perspective. But this game really didn't live up to my memory of being as enjoyable as I remember it. I found the story to be uninteresting. I didn't remember a thing about it, actually, when I was playing this. I also felt like the controls in this game were broken. Definitely not as smooth as I remember in Grand Theft Auto. Ratings of this game usually range around 7 or 8 out of 10, and I guess I would probably give this about the same rating, but I would lean more towards the 7 part.
I've done that with one hand tied behind my back.
So there you have it. Those are games that supported HD resolutions on the original Xbox. A couple of things to note is that I did use an unmodded Xbox to capture all of this footage using component cables, but I will put the caveat on there that the video footage that I'm showing may look slightly better than the actual footage that was coming out of the Xbox due to the fact that I use the RetroTink 5X, which upscales the footage automatically to 1080p, and my capture card, as well as my video editing software, automatically de-interlace footage upon rendering the video. But that said, what do you think about the Xbox's ability to render games in HD resolutions in between the year 2001 and 2005 when this system was Microsoft's flagship game console? I'm also interested if any of you are watching that were early adopters of HD and actually played these games in their full HD resolutions back during that time. Either way, feel free to leave me a comment below. Overall, my thoughts on the Xbox being able to put out HD video back in that time frame, again, is kind of an insane idea. It really showed how Microsoft was trying to be on the cutting edge, but it also kind of embodied Microsoft's philosophy that they wanted to try to combine as much as they could from the PC side of gaming and merge that into console gaming experiences. Gaming PCs were obviously capable of higher resolutions than consoles at that time, but the Xbox really got it as close as they could. The GameCube was capable of putting out progressive scan video, but I don't think any game actually put out higher resolution than 480p. The PlayStation 2 would also support progressive scan on some titles with their component cables, and some of those were even widescreen, but very few titles supported higher resolution than that. In the end though, I don't think it would have made that much of a difference to me personally as a gamer back then. I'm very happy to have had my PlayStation 2, as a lot of Sony's franchises I was really heavily invested in, and because I wouldn't own my first HD TV until 2006, it really didn't make much of a difference to me in this console generation. So even though I think it's impressive today, it was definitely overkill for what I needed back in the day. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A special thanks to those Patreons you see on screen. Also, if you like what you see, please remember to leave a like and click that subscribe button on your way out. As always, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.